If you had met me a few years ago, you probably would have thought I was a quiet woman who simply preferred a peaceful life. You would have seen someone polite, careful with her words, someone who rarely argued, and almost never raised her voice. What you would not have seen is that the quietness people admired in me was never truly a personality trait. It was a survival skill I had learned inside a house where even breathing too freely could feel like breaking a rule. For most of my life, every decision I made belonged to someone else. Where I studied, where I worked, when I returned home, who I spent time with, even the future I was expected to build, all of it had already been decided, long before I ever had the chance to choose it myself. And the person who decided those things was not a stranger, not an employer, not even a teacher. It was the man who married my mother. The strange part is that control like that does not appear overnight. It grows quietly, slowly, the way shadows stretch across a room when the sun begins to set. At first, you barely notice it, and by the time you finally realize how dark the room has become, the light is already gone. My name is Amelia Carter, and I am 28 years old. For most of those 28 years, I lived inside a life designed by my stepfather, Richard Hayes. People in our town respected Richard. They described him as disciplined, successful, responsible. He owned several properties, managed his business with careful attention, and carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed structure was the only path to a stable life. From the outside, he looked like the kind of person any family would feel lucky to have. What people never saw was how that same discipline turned into something else once the front door closed behind him. But none of that was obvious in the beginning. The day my mother remarried Richard was the day everything started to change, although I was too young at the time to recognize it. The wedding was small and quiet, held in a modest church on the edge of town where sunlight filtered through tall stained glass windows and painted soft colors across the wooden floor. My mother looked happier that day than I had seen her in years. Raising me alone after my biological father disappeared had exhausted her in ways she rarely talked about. Long shifts at work, bills that never seemed to stop arriving, and the quiet loneliness of handling every responsibility by herself had slowly worn her down. When Richard entered our lives, he looked like an answer to every one of those problems. He was calm, organized, and certain about everything he said. When he shook my hand, after the ceremony, his grip was steady, and he told me something that sounded reassuring at the time. He promised that from that day forward, he would take care of our family. For a while, it felt like he meant it. During the first months after the wedding, our home became more structured than it had ever been before. Richard believed routines created stability, and he introduced schedules for nearly everything. Meals were served at the same time every evening. The house stayed clean because chores were assigned carefully. Bills were paid on time because he tracked every expense with meticulous attention. My mother seemed relieved by the order he brought into our lives. After years of struggling to keep everything together alone, the idea of someone else sharing the responsibility gave her a kind of peace she had not experienced in a long time. At first, the changes felt helpful rather than restrictive. Looking back now, I understand something important about control. It rarely arrives with obvious cruelty. Most of the time, it enters quietly, disguised as protection or responsibility. And by the time people recognize what it has become, the system around them is already firmly in place. Richard's influence over our home expanded slowly but steadily. At the beginning, he simply organized daily routines and offered suggestions about how things should be managed. Soon, those suggestions began sounding more like expectations. Eventually, they became rules that everyone followed without questioning them. My mother stopped making certain decisions because Richard always had a plan ready before she even finished thinking about the problem. If something in the house needed attention, he already knew the solution. If an important choice appeared, he explained confidently what the logical outcome should be. Little by little, the authority inside our home shifted until his voice carried more weight than anyone else's. I was still a teenager when I first noticed how completely his opinions shaped our lives. The realization came during my final year of high school, when students everywhere were beginning to think about college and the kind of future they hoped to build. For years, I had loved drawing and designing small illustrations and sketchbooks that slowly filled my desk drawers. Teachers often encouraged me to explore art programs at universities because they believed I had real potential. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to imagine a future built around creativity. One evening during dinner, I finally gathered enough courage to talk about those dreams. I explained the universities I hoped to apply to and described the design programs that excited me most. While I spoke, Richard listened quietly, his expression calm and thoughtful. For a brief moment, I believed he might support the idea. Instead, he placed his fork carefully beside his plate and began explaining something he called the realities of adult life. According to him, artistic careers were unpredictable and unreliable. People who chose them often struggled financially and spent years chasing opportunities that rarely provided stability. His voice remained steady as he spoke, but by the time he finished, the conversation no longer belonged to me. Richard informed me that I would apply to a business program at a nearby university instead. He had already researched the curriculum and believed it would prepare me for a disciplined career with dependable income. My mother sat quietly beside him during the entire conversation. She did not argue with his decision, and although I could see the sympathy in her eyes, she never challenged the authority behind his words. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how easily my plans had disappeared. Until that moment, I had believed my future would be shaped by choices I made for myself. Instead, I discovered that someone else believed he had the right to choose those things for me. College continued under that same pattern of supervision. Richard monitored my grades, reviewed my course selections each semester, and reminded me frequently that discipline was the foundation of success. My days filled with responsibilities that left little room for personal exploration. Between part-time work, academic obligations, and household expectations, every hour seemed accounted for. Even my social life came under quiet observation. Richard often asked detailed questions about where I had been and who I spent time with. He preferred that I return home early, in the evening rather than staying out with friends late at night. At first, these questions sounded like concern, but gradually they began to feel like inspections. Years passed in that careful balance between obedience and quiet frustration. By the time I reached my mid-20s, the system had become so familiar that challenging it felt almost impossible. Many people my age were moving to new cities, building independent careers, and making decisions without asking anyone for permission. Meanwhile, I still lived inside a structure where nearly every choice passed through Richard's approval. Then, when I was 25, something unexpected happened. I met Daniel Brooks. Our first meeting took place during a weekend workshop at a small design studio in town that occasionally hosted creative classes. Attending that workshop required more negotiation at home than it should have, because Richard believed extracurricular activities should always serve practical career goals. Eventually, he allowed me to participate after seeing the workshop. Advertisement mentioned digital marketing design. Daniel was one of the instructors. He worked as an architect, but volunteered at the studio occasionally because he believed creative communities helped people discover abilities they might otherwise ignore. From the moment he began explaining design principles, it was clear he viewed creativity very differently from the rigid structure I knew at home, where Richard believed life should follow strict rules to guarantee predictable outcomes. Daniel spoke about curiosity, exploration, and the importance of questioning assumptions. Listening to him felt strangely liberating, as though someone had opened a window in a room I did not realize had been closed for years. Over the following weeks, I continued attending sessions at the studio whenever possible. Daniel and I began speaking after classes about art, architecture, and the ways different forms of creativity influenced each other. Our conversations felt natural, in a way I was not used to. For the first time in years, I found myself sharing thoughts openly, rather than measuring every word. Gradually, our connection deepened. Daniel never pressured me to reveal more about my life than I felt comfortable sharing, yet he listened carefully whenever I described the strict environment I lived in. The more he understood about Richard's influence over my decisions, the more thoughtful his expression became. One evening after a class ended later than usual, Daniel walked with me through the quiet parking lot where streetlights reflected softly across the pavement. Our conversation drifted toward the subject of independence, and I admitted something I had never spoken aloud before. I told him that sometimes I felt as though my life belonged to someone else. Daniel listened quietly before explaining that independence could not be forced by someone else's encouragement. True freedom, he believed, only arrived when a person decided they were ready to claim it themselves. His words stayed with me long after I drove home that night. Eventually, Daniel asked if he could meet my family. The request filled me with both excitement and dread. Part of me hoped Richard might recognize Daniel's sincerity and accept the possibility of our relationship. I convinced myself that if he saw how respectful and thoughtful Daniel was, he might understand that my life could include choices he had not personally arranged. That hope disappeared the night Daniel visited our house for dinner. Richard observed him carefully throughout the meal, asking questions that sounded polite but carried a subtle edge of judgment. Daniel answered each one calmly, describing his career and the projects he worked on as an architect. When the conversation turned toward our relationship, Richard's expression changed. After dinner ended, he asked Daniel to leave so that he could speak with me alone. The conversation that followed changed everything. Richard explained that relationships often distracted young people from disciplined futures. He believed my involvement with Daniel threatened the structure he had spent years building for my life. Then he made a final declaration. He informed me that he would not allow the relationship to continue and expected me to end contact with Daniel immediately. Standing in the living room that night, I felt the familiar weight of his authority pressing down on me once again. For years, I had followed his decisions because resisting them seemed impossible. But this time, something inside me refused to accept the silence that had defined so much of my life. I returned to my room and sat beside the window, staring into the quiet darkness outside the house. And for the first time in years, a question formed in my mind that refused to disappear. How long can someone live inside a life that does not belong to them? That night, I realized something I had been avoiding for years. The house I lived in was not simply a home. It was a cage. And somewhere deep inside me, the first small desire to escape had finally begun to grow. There is a particular kind of silence that exists inside controlled homes, and once someone has lived inside it long enough, they begin to recognize it the way sailors recognize changes in the wind. It is not the peaceful silence people describe when they talk about quiet evenings or calm neighborhoods. It is a silence filled with restraint, with unspoken rules, with thoughts that remain trapped behind careful expressions. Because speaking them out loud might disturb the fragile balance everyone has learned to maintain. After the night, Richard declared that my relationship with Daniel would end. That silence inside our house became heavier than it had ever been before. The walls themselves seemed to absorb every unsaid word, every suppressed emotion, every moment where I wanted to challenge his authority, but felt the old habit of obedience tightening around me like a rope that had been tied years earlier. For several days after Daniel visited our home, Richard behaved as though the situation had already been resolved. He returned to his routines with the same calm discipline he always displayed, reviewing business documents in the evenings, discussing household plans with my mother, and occasionally asking me about my work as though nothing significant had happened. That calmness was not reassuring. It was suffocating. The absence of conflict did not mean the problem had disappeared. It simply meant Richard believed the outcome had already been decided. My mother moved through the house quietly during those days, and although she avoided discussing the confrontation directly, I could sense the tension in her posture whenever Richard entered the room. She loved him in a way that came from years of relying on his stability. Yet she also understood that the decision he had made about my life was something she had not truly participated in. Her silence, which had once seemed like acceptance, now felt more like uncertainty. As for me, I carried a storm of emotions that refused to settle into something simple or manageable. Part of me wanted to obey Richard, the way I had done for most of my life, because obedience had always preserved the fragile peace inside our household. Another part of me felt an unfamiliar resistance rising slowly in my chest, like a quiet voice asking why my future should belong to someone who was not living it. During those days, I continued communicating with Daniel, although our conversations became more careful than before. We met in quiet places around town, where the rhythm of ordinary life continued without interference from the tensions shaping my home: coffee shops, public parks, long walks along streets lined with small shops that closed early in the evening. Those moments outside the house became small pockets of freedom where I could breathe without feeling the weight of someone else's expectations pressing. Against every thought, Daniel never pressured me to choose between him and my family, which somehow made his presence even more powerful. Instead, he listened patiently whenever I tried to explain the complicated dynamics that had defined my life for years. The more I described Richard's influence over my decisions, the more thoughtful Daniel's expression became, as though he were studying a pattern that revealed something deeper than simple strictness. One evening, as we sat on a quiet bench in a small park near the design studio, Daniel spoke about something that had been forming in his mind. During our conversations, he explained that people who control others rarely rely on force alone. Instead, they build systems of expectation and fear that make obedience feel easier than resistance. He described it almost like architecture, comparing authority to a structure supported by invisible pillars. If those pillars remained unchallenged, the structure appeared permanent and unbreakable. But if someone began questioning the foundation holding everything in place, even the strongest systems could collapse unexpectedly. I listened carefully while he spoke, because something about that idea felt strangely familiar. Richard's authority inside our home had always seemed absolute. Yet when I examined it closely, I realized that much of it depended on habits that had been accepted without discussion. My mother rarely questioned his decisions because she had grown accustomed to trusting his judgment. I rarely resisted his instructions, because I had learned from a young age that challenging them only created conflict that rarely ended in my favor. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Richard's control over my life was built largely on the assumption that no one inside the house would openly oppose him. That realization did not immediately give me the courage to change anything, but it planted a seed of possibility that refused to disappear. Meanwhile, life inside the house continued, under the same strict rhythm Richard had established years earlier. Every morning began with predictable routines. Breakfast was served at the same time each day. Richard left for his office shortly after reviewing messages related to his real estate business, and my mother organized household tasks in the quiet, methodical way she had adopted since marrying him. Outwardly, everything looked stable. Yet beneath that surface, I felt the growing tension of a decision that could no longer remain postponed. One evening, about 2 weeks after the confrontation with Daniel, an unexpected moment shifted something inside me. Richard's older sister, Evelyn Hayes, came to visit for dinner. Evelyn was not someone who visited frequently, but when she did, her presence always carried a quiet weight that changed the atmosphere of the house. She was several years older than Richard, and possessed a calm, observational nature that made her appear slightly detached from the family dynamics unfolding around her. Throughout my childhood, she had watched Richard's behavior with an expression that suggested she understood more than she ever said aloud. She rarely interfered in household matters, yet her silence felt different from my mother's silence. It was not based on dependence or fear. Instead, it seemed to come from careful evaluation. That evening, we gathered around the dining table the way we always did when guests visited. Richard discussed his latest property investments with the same confident tone he used when explaining business strategies to clients. My mother listened attentively while serving dinner, occasionally adding comments that encouraged the conversation to continue smoothly. For a while, everything felt normal. Then the conversation shifted in a direction none of us expected. Evelyn asked Richard whether he ever worried about becoming too controlling with the people around him. The question sounded casual on the surface, but the quiet seriousness in her voice made the room suddenly still. Richard responded with a short laugh that carried a hint of irritation. He explained that leadership required decisiveness and that families functioned best when someone was willing to establish clear expectations. Evelyn studied him for a moment before replying with an observation that would remain in my mind long after that. Dinner ended. She suggested that there was a difference between leadership and domination, and that people often confused the two when they believed authority belonged exclusively to them. Richard dismissed her comment with visible impatience, explaining that people obeyed strong leaders because structure made life easier. Then he said something that felt like a key unlocking a door inside my thoughts. He explained that most individuals followed rules not because they agreed with them, but because they believed the person enforcing those rules controlled their future. The moment those words left his mouth, I felt a quiet shift inside my understanding of everything that had happened in my life. For years I had obeyed Richard, partly because I believed he held power over my security, my home, and my relationship with my mother. That belief had created a barrier that made resistance feel dangerous and uncertain. But hearing him describe authority so openly made something else clear. His power depended on our belief in it. If that belief disappeared, the structure supporting his control might not be as solid as it appeared. The idea frightened me at first because questioning a system that had shaped my life for so long felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory. Yet the more I reflected on Richard's words, the more I realized that my obedience had been sustained largely by habit and fear rather than genuine agreement. Over the following days, I began observing my stepfather more carefully than I ever had before. I noticed how frequently he assumed his opinions would become final decisions without needing to ask whether anyone else agreed. I watched the subtle ways conversations changed direction whenever he entered the room, as though everyone instinctively adjusted their thoughts to align with his expectations. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Richard's authority did not come from violence or explicit threats. Instead, it emerged from years of reinforced behavior where questioning him simply never happened. Recognizing that pattern did not immediately free me from it, but it gave me something I had never possessed before: perspective. For the first time, I began imagining what might happen if someone inside that house refused to follow the script Richard had written for our lives. Meanwhile, my relationship with Daniel continued to grow in quiet ways that strengthened my resolve without forcing me into decisions I was not ready to make. He understood that the situation inside my home was complex and that escaping it would require more than emotional determination. One evening, as we walked along a quiet street after dinner, Daniel spoke about the difference between reacting and choosing. Reacting meant allowing circumstances to push someone toward a decision made out of desperation. Choosing meant recognizing the moment when a person finally understood their own worth and refused to accept a life that denied it. His words did not sound dramatic or confrontational. Instead, they carried the calm certainty of someone who believed independence was a natural, human right rather than a rebellious act. Those conversations slowly transformed the way I viewed my own situation. For years, I had believed Richard's authority was something permanent, like a wall built from stone that could never be moved. Now I began to see it as something else entirely. It was a structure sustained by silence, and silence, once broken, could change everything. By the time autumn began settling over our town, I felt the quiet determination of someone who understood that the life she had been living could not continue indefinitely. Every day inside the house felt like standing at the edge of a decision that had been forming slowly for years. Richard, however, seemed unaware that anything had changed. He continued speaking about my future, as though it remained entirely under his supervision. Occasionally, he mentioned introductions to families he believed would be appropriate for me to meet, always framing those suggestions as opportunities rather than restrictions. Each time he spoke about those plans, the same realization returned to my mind with increasing clarity. His authority depended on my obedience, and obedience was something I no longer felt certain I could continue offering. I did not yet know exactly how the confrontation would happen or what consequences it might bring. What I did know was that the quiet acceptance that had defined my past had finally reached its breaking point. Somewhere deep inside me, a decision had begun forming. Sooner or later, the silence inside that house would end. There are moments in life when change does not arrive gradually, but instead gathers quietly beneath the surface until one single day finally carries the weight of everything that came before it. When that day arrives, it rarely looks dramatic from the outside. There are no warning signs visible to strangers, no sudden storms announcing that something fundamental is about to shift. To everyone else, the world appears exactly the same as it did the day before. Yet for the person standing at the center of that moment, everything feels different. The morning that event, Richard's authority began like any other morning inside our house. The same routine, their usual precision, the same quiet movements through familiar rooms, the same unspoken expectations guiding every action. From the outside, nothing had changed. The neighborhood remained calm. The streets carried the gentle rhythm of people leaving for work, and the house itself looked as orderly and composed as it always had. But inside me, something had finally settled into certainty. For weeks after the dinner where Richard announced his plans to introduce me to a man he believed would be a suitable partner, the tension in the house had continued to grow. The conversation had not been repeated openly, yet the assumption behind his words lingered. In every interaction that followed, he believed the future he had outlined for my life was already set in motion. I understood then that if I remained silent, that assumption would become reality. The realization did not arrive as anger or sudden rebellion. Instead, it formed slowly through reflection, through long evenings spent examining the years I had lived under his control and the quiet understanding that my life could not continue along a path I had never chosen. I had spent most of my childhood and early adulthood believing Richard's authority was immovable, like a structure built into the foundation of our family. Yet over time I had begun to see something different. His power had always depended on one simple condition: my obedience. Without that obedience, the structure he relied upon might not stand as firmly as he believed. The opportunity to confront that truth arrived on an evening that Richard himself had arranged. He invited his sister Evelyn to dinner again, along with my mother and me, intending to discuss what he described as important plans regarding the future of the family. The tone of his invitation carried the same quiet confidence he always displayed when he believed events were unfolding exactly according to his expectations. The house prepared for the dinner, the same way it always did when Richard wanted to present something significant. The dining table was set carefully with dishes reserved for special occasions, and my mother moved through the kitchen with the nervous concentration she often displayed when trying to ensure everything appeared perfect. Throughout the afternoon, I remained calm, in a way that surprised even me. The weeks of reflection and quiet conversations with Daniel had slowly replaced my earlier fear with something steadier. I was no longer thinking about whether I had the courage to challenge Richard's authority. Instead, I was thinking about how long I had allowed it to define my life. As evening settled over the neighborhood, the familiar sound of Richard's car entering the driveway echoed through the house. A few minutes later, Evelyn arrived, greeting my mother warmly before taking her seat at the table with the composed expression she always carried during family gatherings. Dinner began with the same polite conversation that usually filled the early part of such evenings. Richard spoke about developments in his business, describing property negotiations and market trends with the confident tone of someone who believed careful planning could shape nearly every outcome in life. Eventually, as the plates were cleared and the conversation slowed, he leaned back slightly in his chair and turned his attention toward me. The shift in the room was immediate, subtle yet unmistakable. Richard began speaking about responsibility, about the importance of building a stable future and making decisions that reflected discipline rather than emotion. His words followed a familiar pattern, one I had heard many times throughout my life. According to him, Families functioned best when individuals trusted the guidance of those with more experience and clearer judgment. Then he explained that he had recently been in contact with a business associate whose son was preparing to settle down and build a family of his own. The young man, Richard said, possessed admirable qualities and came from a respectable background that aligned well with the kind of future he envisioned for me. As he spoke, the implication behind his words became clear. Richard believed he had already begun arranging a meeting that would introduce me to this man as a potential husband. For several seconds, the room remained silent. My mother looked down at the table, as though the pattern in the tablecloth required careful study. Evelyn watched Richard with the same thoughtful expression she had displayed during our previous dinner together. In the past, I would have remained quiet during such a moment, allowing Richard's expectations to settle into place without challenge. That silence had defined most of my life. But something had changed inside me during the weeks leading to that evening. I realized that if I continued remaining silent, I would be accepting a future that belonged entirely to someone else. Slowly, I placed my hands on the table and began speaking in a calm voice. That felt steadier than I expected. I explained that for many years, I had respected Richard's role in our family and understood the effort he had invested in creating stability for our home. I acknowledged the structure he valued and the discipline he believed guided responsible decisions. Then I continued speaking about something he had never truly considered. I described what had already been determined by someone else's expectations. I spoke about the countless moments when I had chosen silence instead of disagreement because preserving peace inside the house seemed easier than challenging authority that appeared absolute. My words did not come out as accusations or angry protests. Instead, they carried the quiet honesty of someone finally describing experiences that had remained hidden for years. I talked about the college program I had entered because it aligned with Richard's plans rather than my own interests. I explained how relationships, friendships, and even personal ambitions had often been shaped by his approval, rather than my genuine desires. As the room listened, I continued describing the slow realization that had grown inside me during the past months. I had reached a point in my life where I could no longer accept decisions made on my behalf without my consent. The future Richard described for me might appear practical and well organized from his perspective, but it was not the life I wanted to live. When I finished speaking, the silence that followed felt deeper than any silence I had experienced in that house before. Richard's expression remained controlled, yet something in his posture suggested he had not expected the conversation to move in that direction. For years, he had spoken with the certainty that his authority would never be questioned directly. Now that assumption was beginning to shift. He responded by explaining that his intentions had always focused on protecting our family from mistakes that often came from emotional choices. According to him, discipline ensured stability, and stability created security for everyone involved. Before he could continue, Evelyn spoke for the first time since the conversation began. Her voice remained calm, yet the words she offered carried a quiet clarity that changed the atmosphere of the room. She observed that guidance within a family should never replace an individual's right to shape their own life. While experience could provide valuable perspective, it could not justify controlling another person's future without their agreement. Hearing her speak those words aloud created a shift I could almost feel in the air around the table. For years, Richard's authority had relied partly on the assumption that no one within the family would openly question his decisions. Now that assumption was unraveling in front of him. My mother looked up slowly, her expression reflecting emotions that seemed both conflicted and thoughtful. She had spent so many years accepting Richard's leadership that imagining a different balance inside our home required time and courage. Then she said something that none of us had heard her say before. She explained quietly that while Richard had brought stability to our lives, during difficult years, that stability did not give him ownership over Amelia's future. The moment those words left her mouth, The structure Richard had relied upon for so long began to weaken in a way that could not be hidden. For the first time since I had known him, he appeared uncertain about how to respond. The authority that once filled every corner of our house suddenly felt less solid, as though the foundation beneath it had shifted. I realized then that Daniel's description of power had been completely accurate. Authority survives only as long as people continue believing in it. Once that belief begins to fade, the system supporting it loses its strength. The conversation that followed did not erupt into shouting or dramatic confrontation. Instead, it unfolded slowly as years of unspoken feelings finally entered the open space between us. Richard tried explaining that his actions had always been motivated by responsibility, yet the certainty behind those explanations no longer carried the same weight. For the first time in my life, I felt completely free to respond without fear of the consequences that once controlled my silence. Eventually, the evening reached a quiet conclusion. No formal agreement was announced. No final declarations were made. Instead, something much simpler occurred. The authority Richard had exercised for so many years simply stopped working. When the dinner ended, I stood from the table and walked toward the front door of the house, where I had spent most of my life. Outside, the evening air felt cool and calm, carrying the gentle sounds of a neighborhood settling into nighttime routines. Daniel waited beside his car near the curb, exactly as he had promised earlier that day. As I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, I realized something important. I was not running away from my family. I was walking toward my own life. For 28 years, I had believed Richard controlled my future because I had never imagined the possibility of refusing his authority. That night I discovered the truth was much simpler. The moment I stopped obeying, his control disappeared. And for the first time in my life, the future ahead of me finally felt like it belonged to me. Have you ever felt controlled by someone in your family? Tell me in comments.